Okay, welcome everyone for today's University of Texas Energy Symposium. This is the last scheduled weekly energy symposium of this semester, spring 2024. It's April 16th, 2024. I'm Gary King, a research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute. And it's a pleasure to introduce a speaker and the discussants today for today's talk. We're having many of the best of our own who think about energy and environmental policy and law. So today's speaker is here in the middle. He will give some introductory remarks. This is David Spence. He's professor of energy law here at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a professor in the Business, Government, and Society Department of the McCombs School of Business. And he's the Rex G. Baker Chair in Natural Resources Law at the UT School of Law. He's the author of the forthcoming book, which we will be hearing about today, Climate of Contempt, Rescuing the Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship. He's also the co-author of the energy law textbook, Energy Economics and the Environment, earned his PhD political science from Duke and his JD from the University of North Carolina. And so today he is going to give some opening remarks, largely about his book, and then we're going to have two people discuss his remarks and the concepts in his book, and then we'll have time for the audience here in person and of course online to ask questions via the question and answer feature on Zoom. And so here is his discussants. We have on my farthest left, Sheila Olmstead, who's professor of LBJ School of Public Affairs, and she's the Dean Russ Chair. She's an environmental economist and pays a lot of attention to the economics of climate change, pricing carbon, and policies related to decarbonization. And then closest to me here is Josh Busby, who's also a professor of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and he pays a lot of attention to energy policies, environmental policies, and particularly has done a significant study on the role of decarbonizing India and other developing countries. So with that said, I'm now going to hand it over to David to make some introductory remarks.
Thanks very much, Carrie. I do have two slides, which I'm just going to leave up as I talk. But first, let me thank all of you in the room for coming, and those at home for coming. Those of you in the room chose us over Beto O'Rourke today. He's speaking on campus right now, and yes, we will be offended if you get up and walk out now that you learned that. Thank you for being here. I want to thank Josh and Sheila for taking time out of their busy schedules to offer comments on what I'm about to say and on the book, because that makes for a much more interesting presentation than me just talking about this topic. And I want to thank Carrie for giving me an opportunity to talk about the book in this forum. Talking about an academic book like this one at conferences can propel sales well into the upper double digits. So it's nice of them to let us do that. And so I'm just going to summarize in 15 minutes what I think the main points of the book are, and I'm putting my timer on to make sure I don't go beyond that 15 minutes. It is an academic book. It brings to bear a lot of research from a variety of different social science disciplines to talk about the energy transition. And I don't know everyone in this room, but I imagine everybody knows what we mean by the energy transition. That is the movement toward lower carbon and aspirationally and that zero carbon economy in a relatively quick time frame. And it's not about the technology fight, what technologies we ought to rely on, and it's not about what policies even we ought to rely on. It's really about the politics that lies behind those debates, and what I think is a misunderstanding of that politics that we sometimes see in the dominant frames, dominant narratives that we see both in the mainstream media and online, pretty much everywhere. And I think when I boil down the book, I think it really tries to marshal those bodies of research toward two basic points that I want to sort of inject into the discussion. And one is that I think voters play a much larger role in determining energy policy outcomes, and always have, than we hear about in the dominant discussions of this issue. And the second is the book tries to elaborate on the role of the modern information environment as a kind of hyper-efficient propaganda machine for disseminating both falsehoods and all kinds of misunderstanding of issues, of politics, and of each other. So that's really what the book tries to do. Part one of the book is, as the title suggests here, that you can see on the table of contents, is really a history of the evolution of the energy regulatory state in the United States, sort of a legal and political history. Chapter 2 explains the major environmental regulation that constitutes today's energy regulatory state as the product of a series of what I call Republican moments. It starts with the proposition that Congress people, politicians generally, obsess about re-election. That's what they care about first and foremost. And so they are worried all the time about losing votes in the next election. And Republican moments are those moments where groundswells of voter concern about something forces them to take action and create regulatory statutes. And the regulatory state, the energy regulatory state, is more than 100 years old. And I explain all of the various statutes that constitute that body of law using that model, this Republican moment model. And there were only relatively few periods in American history where all the conditions for creating those kinds of moments were in place. And there's basically 3 of them, according to the political science literature. You need to have that groundswell of public concern. You need to have some, at least ostensible, or solution to the problem people are concerned about. And most crucially, you need a receptive partisan environment in Congress. And when you have all 3 of those things, you get these bursts of regulatory energy in Congress. And the chapter 2 goes through the history of the passage of those laws from the, all the way back to the populist era in the late 19th century, up through the sort of environmental decade of the 1970s. Before World War II, we were focused on, Congress was focused on providing as many people as possible with access to new types of energy at affordable prices. That's what those laws were about. After Congress, most of the energy was devoted to trying to make the energy sector cleaner and safer. So environmental health and safety laws were really the focus after World War II. And so that's what chapter 2 really describes. It also notes that in all of these cases, every single statute, all of them were passed by 75% or more majorities in both houses of Congress. Durable regulatory legislation has to be overwhelmingly popular in order to happen, it seems, at least historically. And by regulatory legislation, I mean legislation with sticks as well as carrots. So subsidies are much easier to pass than mandates and regulations. So the other 2 chapters in part 1 really sort of trace the remaining evolution of that regulatory state through the late 20th century deregulatory era, which touched not only energy, but also telecommunications and finance and a bunch of other sectors. That was also associated with the movement to the ideological right by the Republican Party after the Reagan administration. So the polarization we have now sort of started then. And in the 21st century, which is covered in chapter 4, we focus on sort of the more recent efforts to try and get climate legislation and how they have been hampered by not only that polarization, but by the rise of a kind of bitter partisan tribalism that has become more prominent in the 21st century. Political scientists call that affective negative partisanship. Affective meaning partisanship as part of your identity rather than a bundle of policy beliefs that you have. And negative meaning you're more focused on stopping the other party, opposing them, than you are on what your party's agenda is. And political scientists measure these things, just like they measure polarization. And so do pollsters. And so the book outlines that the sort of key lessons from those literatures showing that both of these things have been increasing rapidly. And so the failure of the United States Congress to pass climate legislation in 2010 came very close but failed. And again in 2021 with the Build Back Better bill, both of those failures can be tied to sort of solid opposition in the Republican Party and the opposition of one or more coal state Democrats, depending upon which example we're talking about. And that opposition can be explained as representational, representing opposition among each senator's voting constituents, or at least the ones in their party, which is who they are trying to represent nowadays. And so that's an application of my political model to that history, and that's what part one of the book is really about. And what it leads to right now and today is a world in which each party increasingly sees winning as a moral imperative. And when you see winning as a moral imperative, it becomes easier to justify the means reasoning, and that makes for an unsustainable political environment. Trying to keep my time here. So part two is forward-looking. Part two of the book looks at the energy transition as a political task and how modern technology and modern media have changed the way politicians protect their re-election interests. And chapter 4 starts by chronicling the rise of ideological media and social media as replacements, essentially, for many people for the traditional media that we knew when I was your age. And the switch that has occurred has a lot to do with the balance of supply and demand for information and news. When I was young, there were 3 networks, a daily newspaper, a daily half-hour nightly newscast. I had plenty of time to read every story I was interested in to the last paragraph and to look at all the sort of qualifications and nuance and caveats that you find in those later paragraphs. And the reporters had plenty of time to write those kind of stories. Their business was much more lucrative. Nowadays, we have those sources competing with a whole lot more ideological outlets, advocacy journalists, we call them, downright misinformation, Russian bots or bots from everywhere. And you're inundated with information all the time. And so the incentive is to sort of skim, not read to that 20th paragraph if you can, for fear of missing out on something. And that's a problem. That amplifies polarization in a variety of ways. It amplifies negative partisanship. It makes it harder to find the right, reliable, good information than it used to be. The flow of information that comes at you is not as reliable as it was back in the day. And more damagingly, we tend to be shown all of the worst of the other side. Our media flows are censored in ways, the research shows, that steer to us sort of information that confirms our own beliefs already, doesn't show us sort of reasoned challenges to those beliefs, and instead shows us the most crazy or absurd or wild versions of what the other party or the other side of the argument is doing, which of course all ramps up the moral urgency of winning and triggers sort of all sorts of longstanding cognitive biases, attribution errors, and logical fallacies, and so on. And we go over that in chapter 4 of the book. Chapter 5 gets at stuff that we might talk about on the college campus more, and that is the actual nuts and bolts of the politics of making all the different trade-offs or value choices that are associated with trying to get to a lower carbon future. And that's complicated. That's very complicated. Some of us call that the energy trilemma, meaning the idea that there's a tension between a reliable supply of energy, an affordable supply of energy, and a clean supply of energy, a very, very clean supply of energy. And that trilemma, those trade-offs are getting easier with technological advancement, but they're not gone. And so when we try to talk about them in a more public forum, a more general forum, the conversation tends to get contaminated by this sort of moral urgency of each side's belief that they have to win. Here on a college campus, insulated from a lot of that, we can grapple with some of those nuts and bolts issues in a civil and productive way, but it's a lot harder than it used to be, both here and outside of this protected environment. I was at a conference last week that Sheila Olmstead put on, which was a great discussion between people on both sides of carbon sequestration issues, and it was super interesting. And I find that when students get to attend discussions like that, they're usually excited about it because you don't see that kind of give and take respectfully at length that you see. You don't see that online the way you see it in attending a conference like that. And of course, I don't know, I haven't seen any articles about your conference. I don't think these issues, these kind of treatments are covered the way sort of pithy, morally urgent condemnations of each other are covered online. And so that's the reason my book opens with a quote from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or what you think could have beneficial effects if it were believed. And that's harder. That's a harder piece of advice to follow every day, especially if we care really urgently about getting to a particular result. It's hard to avoid that temptation. So chapter 5 concludes by talking about the danger of this kind of boosterism or motivated reasoning or premature certainty about issues contaminating expert discussions online. People rely on experts, even online. The research shows that experts influence the people who follow them online. And when experts get involved in sort of a task of trying to provide the foundation for a social movement rather than trying to educate their followers, it can amplify these problems, these kinds of misunderstandings. So what's the answer? Well, I hesitate to say that there's an answer, but the prescription that I discussed in the last chapter, chapter 6, is really about sort of bottom-up solutions. This is a bottom-up problem that I identified. It starts with voters, and so changing it has to begin with voters. And the research I discussed in chapter 6 is not my area, but I went looking for people who do this research, and I surprisingly found the same advice in many different disciplines. And the advice has to do with how and when and where we talk to each other. Not only do we live in more homogeneous communities, even when we are living in ideologically heterogeneous communities, we are talking on these things, not to each other, right? And so political science, political communication, communication scholars, psychology, anthropology, I discuss a number of bodies of literature that say, look, we've got to talk to each other in person. It's not enough to understand or read about an opposing view. You need to deal with the people that hold those opposing views if you really want to get a flavor and if you really want to understand deeply what that opposing view is all about. And so the last chapter of the book summarizes a lot of that research. I think, let me just add 2 things, then I'll stop because I'm coming up on 15 minutes. But I think it's easier to do that on these issues, energy transition issues, here in Texas than anyplace else. Here in Texas, we have the most oil and gas, we have the most wind. I guess we have the most solar now, or we're close to it. We use the most energy per capita, we have the most pollution. We have a hot state that's getting hotter and drier. We ought to be able to talk to people and run into people representing all the different points of view and converse with them. And it's easier here than it is anywhere else, I think. But regardless of how easy it is, I think that addressing this sort of political dysfunction that characterizes our current moment is really a predicate, I think, to dealing with the policy questions and the technology questions that we deal with to try and get this economy to a lower carbon, to bend the trajectory of emissions downward. This is a dangerous time politically, and we got to deal with that at the same time that we deal with the energy transition as a political challenge. Just over 15 minutes. I'll stop right there. Thank you. Let me just say, Sheila and Josh are going to take up to 10 minutes to sort of react to my book. They've given me comments long ago, so I didn't just throw this at them now. And then we'll take questions from both the room and the Zoom. Who's up first? Who can decide that? You can say Peter. Yeah. All right, David.
Okay. So I wrote some remarks out. We'll see how they go. We'll try and stay under time. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in the event today. Congratulations to David on this book and your contributions to this important topic of the clean energy transition. I had the good fortune to read a draft of the manuscript, and this is a topic near and dear to my interest. So David and I agree that the clean energy transition is fundamentally a political one. The energy transition in America and the world isn't simply a technocratic challenge or an economic one where falling costs of new technologies will seamlessly usher in a new energy economy. For one, the playing field has never been level as fossil fuels are heavily subsidized and supported by government policy. And moreover, if the clean energy transition is to happen on the timescale needed to avoid dangerous climate change, that's going to be supported by intentional government policy to incentivize emerging industries and to develop new technologies for sectors where emissions reductions of greenhouse gases are challenging, such as heavy industry. And indeed, the reason why we now have low-cost, economically mature technologies in terms of wind and solar is a function of state policy, starting in Europe and extended by China to support firms and help them drive their costs down through a variety of policies, including feed-in tariffs, low-cost credit, tax incentives, and more. And David's book provides ample material here on the origins of energy regulation here in the US. And I generally agree with his diagnosis on what ails the American polity in terms of polarization. I think it is true that Democrats and Republicans are in different information universes, which makes a common conversation on an agreed upon set of facts and reasoned debate all the more challenging in a world rife with partisan information ecosystems online, TV, and in print. Having said that, I'm not certain I agree that necessarily is that's what has prevented a breakthrough in the energy and climate space. And I actually think the Inflation Reduction Act was the breakthrough and will ultimately change politics in important ways. And to the extent that more fundamental change is required, I'm not at all certain that an effort to encourage a more collegial, cross-partisan, and by public square conversation on energy will necessarily be all that salutary. And I think one problem that David tends to, but perhaps not as much to my liking, is that the problem of polarization on clean energy, in my mind, is mostly an asymmetric and one-sided one. And he speaks to that. I think there's a possibility that this could be seen or portrayed as a both sides issue, but in my mind, the main problem mostly is one of the Republicans having elevated opposition to action on climate change into a source of partisan identification. And I don't see that primarily as a bottoms-up problem, but one that was exacerbated by both interest groups and key elite figures. So this week, the House of Representatives was intending to hold a series of discussions on Republican bills related to appliances. I don't know if you followed this. The titles included 6 bills with the following titles: the Stop Unaffordable Dishwasher Standards Act, the Liberty and Laundry Act, the Affordable Air Conditioning Act, the Clothes Dryer Reliability Act, and the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act, and the Refrigerator Freedom Act. Now, all of these were meant to undermine the Biden administration's efforts to enhance energy efficiency and environmental performances of appliances. And we've seen this movie before when President Trump sought to undo Obama-era efforts to fade down incandescent light bulbs. All of this, in my mind, makes efforts to reduce polarization through persuasion or better discourse is a little beside the point, and perhaps unlikely to yield hope for improvements in the American polity. And I come to this conclusion a little bit reluctantly as someone who grew up in Texas. I grew up in College Station, and I spent much of my time in recent years trying to do person-to-person outreach via Facebook, not face-to-face, but with many of my high school friends. And I have tried to persuade them through earnest, respectful dialogue about a range of issues, including on energy and the environment. These are the folks who've known me for 40 years. And my ultimate conclusion from many, many hours of this activity, which might make former UT professor James Fishkin proud, but which upset my wife to no end, is that it is almost impossible to change people's minds on social media. There's a classic graphic with the title, Outcome of Political Arguments on Facebook. There's a legend with green, you change your mind. Blue, they change their mind. And red, no one changes anything, everyone's upset, although they're pissed is what the word says. And the pie chart is completely red, right? And that sort of summarizes my experience. And I continue to marvel at folks like the climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech, who just last week on Blue Sky was ardently trying to explain to lefty climate doomers that hope isn't lost, while also trying to convince right-wing denialists that climate isn't a hoax. My concern is life is short, and someone is always wrong on the internet, and efforts to persuade are often pitched at the wrong targets. Cranks and nutcases are not amenable to persuasion. So unfortunately, because of elite stoking, we've now got partisan sorting on many aspects of the clean energy transition, increasingly including renewables and electric vehicles. And while that's partially a function of bottoms-up action, it's been encouraged by elites, by no less Trump himself, who's banged on about toilets, light bulbs, windmills. It didn't have to be this way, and indeed was not always this way. So if you recall, and you probably don't recall because you might have been babies at the time, if there was a moment when Newt Gingrich, you weren't babies, this is 2008, Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, and Nancy Pelosi, also former Speaker of the House, were photographed together in 2008 for the We Can Solve It campaign, a bipartisan effort to build momentum for climate action. And they're going to solve it together. So what happened to lead Republicans to go off the deep end? That's partially about the Tea Party. I think there's something to the arguments that anti-climate change action was likely financed by groups like this advocacy group ALEC that you might have heard of. And I think Republicans became much more hostile to climate action than even business groups. But I don't think this is, and it's not merely Republicans doing the bidding of the private sector. And I don't think it's a product of bottoms-up polarization on both sides, or primarily bottoms-up polarization by Republicans. I think that a lot of this is stoked by elites. And it used to be the case here in Texas, where renewables is now become more of a partisan signifier, division over renewables. And there used to be a lot more robust support in Texas. There still is, actually. We're seeing wind and solar, at record levels. But it's now become much more of a partisan signifier than what once was. That's not solely Trump's doing, of course. That emergent opposition might be a natural consequence of renewables becoming a more real threat to the economic interests of fossil fuel companies. But it's also because elites like Trump's have come out hard against renewables. And so if elites have had a stronger role in cultivating anti-climate sentiment among grassroots Republicans, then I'm not sure the solutions of micro-level acts of persuasion are the antidote. I tend to agree with David Roberts. I don't know if people follow, he's a environmental writer who runs his own Substack, whatever it is now, newsletter. And he says that the only way through is for Republicans who tout anti-climate perspectives to consistently lose elections. Because most Americans are already persuaded that climate change is real, and the hardcore of Republicans who aren't may not be persuadable. So if you've ever looked at Anthony Lacerowitz from Yale University, his Six Americas perspective, that kind of divides into groups, and two of them are not especially persuadable, and they happen to be concentrated on the Republican side of the aisle. So the solution isn't persuading the unpersuadable, but mobilizing the pro-climate supermajority to vote and overcome problems of gerrymandering and voter suppression. That doesn't require demonization of Republicans, but it's a more intentional strategy to get the vote out. And to the extent that the Republicans matter, I think the way that Biden is trying to neutralize opposition through citing decisions of Inflation Reduction Act investments in red states, that may over time diminish hostility to parts of the clean energy transition, namely electric vehicles and batteries, but hopefully extending to renewables as well. So there's a lot of research on elite priming that maybe the solution might be having different elites, messengers come forward to embrace climate solutions, and maybe that will have a bearing on Republican publics. I don't know whether Republican masses will change their tune on climate or energy in the face of elite messaging. I think that's an interesting question. If Republican publics can be persuaded that wind and solar are bad, can they change their minds again? So one final point is that I see the Inflation Reduction Act as a momentous piece of legislation, and the fact that it passed at all is still one of the biggest pleasant surprises of recent years, and there haven't been all that many. So given the structural features of the US system and partisan sorority that David talks about, that's as close as we're going to get to a Republican moment as on energy policy. Maybe we need to come back in a few years to do something more regulatory, and certainly Biden's phase-in of tailpipe rules are a start. But it seems like a pretty incredible achievement, all things considered. So now, a lot of those achievements of the Inflation Reduction Act ultimately hinge crucially on whether or not we can build enough transmission in this country. And a lot of the problems of building more transmission is a function of the legacy of regulatory federalism, multiple gatekeepers that David talks about in his book. I think that's a structural institutional problem rather than one of emergent partisan division. So I'm not sure if going back to the legislative route is going to be viable for a while, barring a shift back to a Democratic majority in both chambers and a Democratic president. In the meantime, the challenge is, can the momentum of the Inflation Reduction Act be sustained, or will a Trump victory in 2024 set in motion the gradual or sudden demise of the IRA and other Biden-era efforts on climate change? The answer in my mind is about getting the vote out through mobilization rather than trying to persuade. But I could be subject to persuasion. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so I loved the book. I too had a chance to see it in an earlier draft, and I broadly agree with David's thesis about polarization and its role in hampering kind of policy progress to support an efficient energy transition. One thing I think, so David talks in the book about science and right, not, kind of being in a new era. Well, it may not feel new to you, but it feels new to me, right? In which we're debating over kind of basic science. And I feel like there's an angle here that is maybe even, if not, maybe it's as destructive, maybe it's a slightly more destructive, but sort of a, polarization of views about analysis more generally. So the kind of skepticism of climate science has kind of crept into skepticism of analysis, in particular things like benefit cost analysis of environmental regulations, many of them right during the Obama and Biden eras kind of targeted at mitigating climate change, and in the Trump years, right, with exactly the opposite viewpoint. And I'll just give you one example. In recent years, as an economist, one of my windows into this is the social cost of carbon, right? So the federal estimates of the damages per ton caused by emissions of carbon dioxide, and there are equivalent estimates for methane and N2O and so on. And near-term estimates of the social cost of carbon from the US federal government have varied from, say, about $53 per ton in the late Obama years to $1 to $5 during the Trump administration, and now $190 in the Biden administration. And you can see the progress from, kind of the view of an empirical academic economist from 53 to 190 as progress indicated by the incorporation of tons of new knowledge on the climate science side, on the economic science side, and the integration of those two. But that kind of punctuation in the middle of the $1 to $5, right, when we're making, kind of federal decisions about climate-related policies based on a very, very low-ball estimate of those damages, as more of a, sort of politicization or polarization of the process of kind of coming up with policy analysis and policy solutions. I mean, it's the thing that's challenging about this, I think, is it takes me a solid 90 minutes of interactive lecture in my master's environmental economics course to explain to smart, interested grad students, right, why this has happened, right, the kind of relative roles of politics versus new information and how we can tease that out, and what it is, what's reasonable within these sets of estimates, and what reasonable people can disagree on. And once politics kind of outweigh analytics in debates like this, there's seemingly nowhere to turn for objectivity, right? It's very easy to just say, well, it's political because it was 50 and then it was 1 and then it was 190, right? Without that, education that it takes to really understand, right, the sort of thread between each of those estimates. And so if the average American, busy, smart, informed about many things, could be, forgiven for giving up on digging in on the social cost of carbon, right, and dismissing efforts to monetize damages in that way as hopelessly political, right? And I think this is just an enormous challenge. It's an enormous challenge that we face as folks that are interested in analysis, right, that are equipped to do analysis, and that may come kind of naively into circumstances where we want to do the best job that we can, right, and explain to people things in a careful way, and face, unfortunately, right, the kind of buzzsaw of, having a purpose for that analysis that may be nefarious. So as analytical people, right, as humans with the training to do better, I think a productive role, in addition to the bottom-up conversations that David's recommending in his book, which I do think actually can be quite productive, having many partisans in my own family and bridging that divide as Josh does with his friends. I think we can also be lobbyists for objectivity in analysis, right? We can think of ourselves, and I think this is a helpful way that I think of myself as, really kind of pushing for that and trying to have honest and careful conversations with folks, right, about and redirecting, right, when it sort of strays into politics. I'll just give you an example. I happen to have the, good or bad fortune, depending on how you think about it, of serving on the Council of Economic Advisors within the White House during the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And I was the point person within the CEA for energy and environmental policy. And so there was a 180-degree shift, right, in the objectives of the folks coming in. And part of that job is understanding kind of what those objectives are and trying to provide, again, objective, right, economic advice on both sides. And so engaging with folks in conversations over things like, right, should we withdraw from the Paris Agreement, or what is this social cost of carbon thing and why is it so high, right? I had several interesting conversations. One of them was with a policy advisor who was particularly influential in the moment, sort of saying very forcefully, you know, you think we're solving a collective action problem, but in fact, we're in the Nash equilibrium, we're the dummies, right? They think they've made all this progress, they thinking about the kind of former administration with China and with others, but really nobody's doing anything. And you know, we're the suckers, right, if we take these steps. And right, it's sort of a long conversation where you say, okay, right, I understand there's one, you know, it's one way of thinking about the world, but isn't the Nash equilibrium, isn't that equilibrium where everybody just sort of pollutes and pollutes, right, rather than trying to solve right, the problem and get to a better outcome? Isn't that a bad equilibrium, right? Wouldn't we want to try to do some things, right? But let's have an analytical conversation about how one makes progress, right, kind of in an international, you know, negotiation situation. From that bad equilibrium. So again, trying to bring it back to right, kind of making an analytical point. And like Josh, I'm skeptical that that kind of engagement helps in all circumstances, and certainly have again kind of walked into the buzzsaw. But sometimes it does. Sometimes it's very effective. Sometimes it's very effective to talk with the president's economic advisors and say, do you know, how many individuals do you believe are employed in the coals, you know, as coal miners? And to say, you know, have them say, well, it's hundreds of thousands of people, and for you to show them data that's actually it's 50,000 individuals in the United States, right? So sometimes if we can find those folks that where we can engage in that analytical conversation and we can have it honestly, and there's some trust that that you can build over time, I think you can make some progress. Again, we sort of can't champion the virtues of sober analysis and critical thinking the way that David does in his book, and then kind of corrupt the very processes that support them. And I think that is what happens when we take, right, you know, science and sort of squeeze it through the pasta machine, right, to try to, you know, kind of make it fit our particular views of the world. And unfortunately, I think there's more of that happening than any of us would like. The second point I wanted to make is really just about kind of economic analysis and economics and the role that it plays in thinking about energy systems broadly, because there's really kind of two strains of thinking about regulation in the book. One is about regulating energy markets, right? You know, worrying about energy prices and who's supplying what, right, within what system. And then the other is about regulating, you know, these external damages, things like, you know, local and regional air pollution, which still kills, you know, north of 100,000 Americans every year, climate change, which generally, you know, creates significant economic damages globally. And I think it's easy to read the book and kind of lump these two in a way together. And I think it behooves us to kind of separate them a little, right? So folks may not agree, right, with this, and I'm not sure, you know, universally economists would agree with this either, but when we kind of put those two different types of regulation, sort of separate them, most economists are generally going to support decentralized decisions about the very first set of things I mentioned, right, kind of energy prices and, you know, sort of who's supplying whom and so on. But centralized regulation to address these problems of externalities, right? And economists have been among the earliest and loudest proponents of things like the carbon tax, not achieved, get it, right? I know that's not where we are. But you know, this is, I think, just something to sort of separate out and think about this difference between, you know, competition and the benefits of competition in energy markets like electricity markets, for example, and regulation, right? On the other hand, they're two very, very different things. I think that's it for my comments. Yeah, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Real quick, let me just make a couple of responses. So with respect to Joshua's comment about elites driving voter behavior that I described, or the changes of voters that I described, I agree with that. And I think the elites that are doing that are in the media for the most part. I think that someone like Trump is responding really sort of instinctively to a set of conditions that have already been created by ideological media, and so you know, I'm not saying that undermines your argument, but I do think that's a hard one to fix from the top down because it involves the First Amendment and a bunch of other things. So the other thing I would disagree with you on is the persuadable. I do talk about both the 6 Americas and a Pew Research typology of voters in the book. I'm not as optimistic as Catherine Hayhoe, who thinks almost everybody's persuadable, but I do think that about a third of the voters out there are persuadable, yet are in our cocoons, informational cocoons. We tend to ascribe to everybody on the other side the most crazy aspects of the other side. And so, well, what I say is that, yeah, you're gonna fail a lot in these in attempts to persuade. I also agree, never online. It's gotta be face to face. That you gotta talk to your neighbors and friends, coworkers, family. Online is really, really hard. Lastly, mobilizing the base. The research that I've read says that mobilizing the base also mobilizes the other side. And that's they sort of cancel each other out, both in terms of lobbying in Congress before bills, but also in elections. The postmortem of the 2020 elections and 2022 in individual elections showed this in many places, and that's particularly problematic in so-called purple districts where a lot of the voters are, where it's going to turn, it's competitive. It's one of the few districts that's competitive. So anyway, thank you both for your comments. I really appreciate it, and your comments that you gave me before I finalized the book were helpful, and I actually made changes in response to the book review, and so I really appreciate it. Terry, are you the master of ceremony?
I'll MC. We got a few questions online. If you have one in the room, raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to start online. I'm going to ask the question and then maybe ask you to generalize it. The question is, if this summer is dramatically hot, what do you think the political impact would be? But the maybe more general question could be, we can observe that the weather is hot, but a lot of these climate discussions are something we're not observing. It's something that may occur in the future. So just how do, in general, do you view the weather and things we can observe as changing behavior and everything you're discussing?
I'll answer first, and then Josh and Sheila will say. For years I've been waiting for the line, the identification of the line, that once you cross it, a whole bunch of people will change their mind. And I don't know where that line is, or even if it even exists. I think that almost every development, including a pandemic that killed more than 1 million Americans, a historic recession or depression, and a whole bunch of other sort of things that I never thought I would see in my lifetime in American life and politics, none of those things caused the kind of pivot that they used to cause and cause partisan realignments in the past. And I ascribe that to the fact that all of these developments are filtered through the modern sort of media bubbles, and and contextualized in a way that reinforces everybody's existing beliefs. And so I don't expect a hot or unprecedented weather to do much this summer. Maybe enough, I don't know what tragedies will cause a shift. I hesitate to predict. But I would be surprised if a super hot summer and some problems with the grid had changed people's votes.
I would just note, there is actually empirical evidence that people are more aware, more sympathetic to kind of energy transit, climate policy, climate-oriented policy, when they've recently experienced, sort of climate extremes. So generally, I think that it's a sad thing to say, right? But if we went through a prolonged period, not just of hot summer, but lots of hurricanes and, damages in red states and this kind of thing, I could imagine, right, that could potentially sway things on average. I do think that even that conversation has been sufficiently polarized, right? That, if you just think about things that were said, well, people make memes about them, right? I ate today, so there's no such thing as famine, right? I was cold last weekend, so there's no such thing as global warming and so on. So I do think that polarization probably mutes the effect of that, but I'm hopeful, right, that as things get worse, it'll get easier to have conversations about doing costly stuff to avoid things getting even worse.
But at the very least, too, you're going to have more traditional news stories. If it's hot, I can get an editor to listen to me about a story about a conversation that I'm having that doesn't have anything to do with the heat, but does have to do with a carbon tax, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Because my angle ends up being, hey, it's hot outside. Y'all know it's hot outside. Now we need to talk about a carbon tax,
yeah.
which is weird, but it happens in newsrooms all the time, right? Like we can have these conversations when things, I think external stuff, I think it matters a lot.
I hope so, Josh.
Yeah, it matters on the margins, but maybe not as much as, we're hoping for some tremendous change. I think there may be more localized things in communities that are sort of frontline, coastal communities, although there's sort of mixed evidence on it. So I think at the end of the day, that there could be marginal effects if there's some catastrophic thing, but I'm trying to think back to the moment after like the Texas freeze, which, you know,
Right.
the climate origins of that, the changes in the winter vortex that are unknown, but just it was sort of refracted through existing partisan lens as well, even though it led to some change, but probably not the fundamental change that those who wanted a more reliable grid, at least from like a left-leaning perspective.
All right, question in the room?
Kind of want to, talk about what you said, there's this super majority of conscious voters typically mobilized. I kind of look around and I see carbon tax underwater in Canada. It's been rejected by voters in Washington. It's been repealed in Australia. There's a backlash in the UK. I mean, how much, and clearly in all these cases, there's an overlap between voters who believe in climate change and are rejecting these policies. Like, is it maybe more that people don't like do-gooding elites telling them like what they should be consuming? Or is it people need to be persuaded to believe in climate change?
Those are different things. Like carbon tax is a very visible instrument that people can see what happens in terms of like costs. I think that the issue is for most voters, they believe in climate change, but it's not super salient in the list of priorities. So there's that. And then if there's carbon taxes are not even like remotely on the agenda in the United States at all. And so it's sort of beside the point if there are other polities that have had some experience with carbon taxes. We're in a moment in which most the climate policy that we have that was viable, that is viable, is subsidies to support the clean energy transition to, you know, and that's incentive driven rather than regulatory. And so I don't know. At the end of the day, I think that the challenge is a different one than the one you described, but it's hard in 30 seconds to like unpack it.
Anything else? Sort of questions here, kind of, well, I'll start with this one. So to what extent are politics of energy and environment separable from other political views? Is this a productive direction for thinking about solutions, or what strategies might be used to separate energy and environmental issues from other political discourse? And there's a couple other things that are related, which is maybe there's like Justice 40 type issues, which are about equity, and then somebody else was saying maybe if people focus on stewardship of the earth or clean air and water, can these be separated from climate, or do they just make people focus on whatever they want?
Yeah. Back when the sort of credit lines were new here in Texas and wind was growing really rapidly, still growing, yes, but I mean, the wind explosion was happening, we used to say, you know, we can talk about being an energy leader, we can talk about jobs in the energy industry, we can talk about Texas being #1 in something, but we can't talk about climate change, right? So as long as you avoided the term climate change, we could sort of gather people around a project of building a lot of wind. And I think that was true. I think that's less true nowadays than it used to be. This is getting folded into sort of identity and cultural issues in ways that I find really bothersome, really bothers me. I mean, it's being treated, I'm using phrases like woke capitalism to talk about climate policy and clean energy policy. So it's becoming folded into the culture war issues that the Republican Party sees as electoral winners, and that's a bad sign for the transition in red states, in my opinion.
I would distinguish between the global context and the US context. And here in the global context, I'm tremendously optimistic about the capacity to focus on the human health damages from local and regional air pollution, particularly from fine particulate matter in countries like India and China, absolutely capable of moving the needle on the same, right, coal emissions, right? You need to sort of think about it's not always the case, right? That when you reduce CO2 emissions, you're also going to reduce these other things. But where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in places like China and India, I actually think that pressure, public pressure, right, from citizens who are just no longer willing to tolerate, right, the extreme, kind of air pollution conditions that they face. We've already seen that change, right, starting to accelerate in China, and I think India is next on that. I don't think people will tolerate it for much longer, and I think that is a clear link to something else that people really, really care about, right? The health of elderly, infants, right, who are at risk on a daily basis. I think in the US context, unfortunately, right, the same thing is true, but we're in a different part of the arc, right, on regulation, and we've right, had a tremendous, decrease in those kinds of air pollutants, although recently wildfire, right, and the fact that, folks in the Northeast and in the Midwest who didn't used to be exposed to these really, really poor air quality conditions, I think are likely to become more sensitized to that, and if we can focus on talking about the things that we're trying to prevent, the things we're trying to make better, rather than, right, how important it is to, save the planet, right, and avoid, 2 degrees C of warming, I think we can probably make more progress, I think, although I'm a little less hopeful for that in the US context than I am.
Yeah, I generally agree, and I think it's a worrisome sign that there, specific technologies get sort of, appealing to some partisan groups and not others, like, we should have it be more like electric vehicles should ultimately take off because they have superior performance and it's easy to charge them. Like e-bikes are taking off like crazy because everybody finds them useful, and it shouldn't be, seen through a partisan lens. It's like if you want an e-bike and it's great to get to work, get an e-bike, and hopefully we can get to that on EVs. And I think that will only break through that if we have an adequate charging network. And if it turns into something that, Democrats buy EVs and Republicans don't buy EVs, and that becomes an enduring fault line, then that's really problematic in this country. But everywhere else, they're just gonna go for the technologies that are superior, and the Chinese are going like crazy into EVs, and we're gonna be very easy to so.
All right, room.
Earlier, you were talking about how bothersome it kind of is that this woke capitalism implying these things. I'm from Catawba County, North Carolina. It's Trump's super county. We're starting to get in that area like tornadoes at night. That never happened. They care a little bit more. But a lot of these people do actually have that, like they do believe that there are such things as illegal immigrants. They do believe that there are 2 genders, and all of these things are so tied together. And I can get them to talk a little bit more about some of these things I care about, but I can't untangle them at all with any of those other things, even when I'm speaking in person with them. And I don't know how you can treat that without dealing with this, and dealing with this would require a lot of like possibly very illiberal decision makings to fix, the negative externalities that these create. And I sort of have a problem with that, So, it is bothersome that it's entangled with these things, but it is like, I think it's so tangled up that, how, do you think it could at all be untangled at any point for the rest of our lives? Because I'm at this point young, but I've not been convinced that it can be.
That's a great point. And one of the digressions in chapter 5 or chapter 4 of my book is on the idea that most political choices are binary, but the motivations for them are multidimensional, right? So when you vote for a bill or a candidate, there's all kinds of issues swirling around in your mind, and every voter has a different weighting for each of those issues. And we know what our thought process is, but we don't know what the other thought process is. So that's part of why we misattribute to all of the 70 million people who voted for Trump, the worst aspects of Trump and Trumpism, right? So so you have to make, you want your issues to be salient, more salient than illegal immigrants and gender issues. But if we're fighting a media behemoth that tries to make those other issues salient all the time, it does happen in both directions. It is a both sides issue. It's not a symmetrical both sides issue. And I say over and over, it's in multiple chapters that it's not symmetrical. And with data on that, but it's hard, right? And so all you can do is keep talking to people about the issues you care about and the ones they care about. We don't do this just to win. People need to listen to each other to be not just to be persuasive, but to understand one another, understand these issues fully. So the conversations you're having in Catawba County, and I lived 10 years of my life in North Carolina. Those are good. I think those are good conversations, even if you don't change the vote of all those people.
I would just say I agree, and I think it's what makes it so powerful when people engaging others on the climate issue are, conservative individuals, right, on other issues. Again, we can disagree about those issues too, right? That's what makes a Catherine Hayhoe or somebody, right, that other folks, maybe a little bit less subject to the echo chamber, right? Because it causes people to say, oh, wait a minute, right? I agree with them on these things, but they're, maybe I trust what they say on these other issues. And I think that's part of it, right? Again, it's not quite bottom up because, right, she's a pretty, public figure, she's elite, right? If we think about, economics or any other way of measuring that, but, finding those voices, right, that are people that are trusted. It's not dissimilar in that way from other environmental issues, like in my class, we were just talking about fisheries and fisheries regulation and right, how we get to the point where you can have tradable quotas and so on and right, to stop the decimation of fish stocks in specific locations. And really often what's most powerful is people in the industry, right, who learn about this, they become convinced, and then they go out and they kind of evangelize for, right, what is it, this is actually gonna make things better for us, not worse, right? But until you have those allies, I think it can be a really difficult conversation. I'm not Pollyannish about that, but I do think finding those conservative voices is really, really important and engaging.
And that goes to Josh's point about different elites, trying to get different elites into the conversation. And there have been Republicans who have tried to champion these issues. They just often, they suffer like at election times.
All right, we have another question here, maybe a little more on Texas, but Winter Storm Uri, February 2021, that was in some sense a rather dramatic energy related event, and it caused, I guess, some changes, like some enhanced regulation of or claim penalties if power plants or natural gas producers don't implement certain practices, and we got a bill on, I guess, loans for natural gas, low cost loans for natural gas plants, but is this an example of things, it caused some new thinking, or did it just cause the wrong thinking, or not enough new thinking? Any thoughts on what that did or didn't cause?
I mean, it caused some good things and some bad things. So the weatherization of power plants that didn't happen after the previous storms, they could have and should have, but didn't, finally happened. So that's good. And some of the other changes in the way ERCOT sort of, like you said, penalize people for not showing up when they say they'll be there. That, that's helpful. Some of the other changes, I would argue, are not terribly helpful because they look more like subsidies to favored technologies than necessary enhancements in reliability. But I suppose the public interest is always contested and in the eye of the beholder.
Okay, so first, on the social media fights, one way I look at it is that my audience isn't necessarily the person I'm fighting with, but the people who are watching the conversation. And I just thought I'd point that out because I've had those people talk to me and say, wow, you really made me think. So I wanted to throw that out there. But then my question was about polarization of the media. Do y'all have any suggestions on how we can fix that? Like put some guardrails? I mean, respect the First Amendment, but somehow.
I say at the end of the book, read long form journalism that's written for a broad audience. And I use the word read, not listen to a podcast, because when you read, you've digested at your own rate, preferred rate. You have time to sit and think about things. I think that's the best advice that I could give, and that's what I see in the literature. But I don't think we're going to stop people from publishing what they want to publish. I would be surprised if. Sheila?
I would just say, I think that he's in a really tough bind here, because it used to be, we used to critique the media because of one side says this and the other side says this, especially on climate, right? As the consensus was really building over decades, right? Saying like, you really can't treat it like that anymore, right? It's things have shifted and you need to, and so, right, and so things have shifted in the media coverage. And here I'm just talking about, right, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, right? I'm not talking about social media necessarily. And so now, right, climate coverage, I think, is generally in these kinds of outlets getting, right, the kind of urgency that it deserves, but it makes it seem as though, right, maybe, right, if you're sort of in a community that resists the science, right, you just it's the science that's debatable, right? So I don't really know what it is we can expect, much more out of the media. I think it's just a really difficult time to be a serious, right, kind of reporter, right, on these issues.
See, I think it's on the consumer to find the right sources. And I disagree with the way David Roberts handles his social media presence, but his Substack column, which is called Volts, is a deep dive into all the nitty gritty issues that I talked about in chapter 5 involving trade-offs. And yes, he throws in some vituperation here and there, but basically it's a really good treatment of those issues. Is Twitter, and I would not follow him on Twitter.
Traditional media is dying and traditional media needs clicks, sadly. So all of my, everybody I talk about, all the fundraisers that I'm dealing with, it's like, well, just get more people to pay attention. So it's all about audience growth, whether that's.
That's the thing that I'm struggling with. We need a new not-for-profit business model of some of these wealthy benefactors, like Bezos buying the Washington Post, or people who are making money in elsewhere. They just need to underwrite papers, hiring people and hiring reporters and doing reporting so people have access to local news. And the local news is going to cover stuff like, Winter Storm Uri or other things that hopefully would drive public attention to lawmakers, that they would make better decisions rather than worse ones. And so, I don't think that's a change that can be driven through bottom up better attention to news feeds if there aren't any local news feeds, because everything's gone bankrupt. And so we need an entirely different, information universe available to us. And those are things that are, discerning people at the individual level who are, college educated can do that and sort through all the draws, but lots of other folks who take the media that they have available to them, and what they have available to them is garbage. And so, and that I think we can fix that, because there are lots of people that have made billions of dollars through the internet or whatever. And if they want to be remembered well by history, they can underwrite not-for-profit news makers.
Not to disparage your podcast. So I was listening to a podcast, it was recently, this guy, Cal Newport, says that Twitter was claiming to be a town square, but he says it's actually more like a Roman Colosseum. It's covering little events that occur. You don't get to see everything. There's a lot more things going on, so that things like Twitter.
Ricky Gervais says it's like what's written on bathroom walls. See every bathroom wall.
We'll maybe we'll go with we'll go one more in the room and then one online and maybe wrap up.
So I was reading a post, it was a Substack post from Branko Milojevic, the elephant curve man. And he writes on the futility of political discussions too, and sort of comes to a similar conclusion. He says, it's more effective to read and write and listen than to have Socratic or ancient dialogues. Maybe that's true, maybe that's false. But then listening to you speak, you say, we are shown kind of the worst of either side. We're steered towards information that confirms our beliefs and doesn't necessarily challenge them. So if each of you had to point us to one or two balanced people on the issues that you most care about that we kind of talked about today, who would those players be that we kind of read or listened to and thought about deeply?
I would go to David. That's me.
Sheila, someone gave him on the
Well, I mean, I like to read, he doesn't write much anymore. He used to have a pretty active blog, but he doesn't anymore. But Greg Mayhew, who's a conservative macroeconomist, worked in the George W. Bush administration and others. It's Manki and doesn't write much anymore. Yeah, I haven't heard, so otherwise, yeah, a hard question.
So in terms of popular sort of general media, I like the way that both the NPR and The Economist cover energy. I think it tends to be fairly comprehensive and complete in the way they and circumspect, which is what I value. And then sort of most mainstream art outlets that have an experienced energy reporter usually, get it right. From my point of view, but you have to sort of think about your own biases and counteracting those biases. So we're all I think we're all left of center up here. We're all probably Democrats. I know I am. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but, and I grew up in upstate New York in a liberal family. I'm in a liberal town. I'm in a liberal faculty at law school. And I like that I'm here in Texas where I'm not going to only see that. And I try to find those other perspectives and listen to them and talk to people from them. Like I get to interact with people from the oil and gas industry here. And so whatever your own bias is, I think that's what you want to work at counteract.
Robinson Myers gets the heat map newsletter that I'm trying to follow.
I get that too.
Costa Samaras just left the Biden administration and good follow on energy stuff. I feel like Blue Sky is sort of where I've migrated because I gave up on Twitter, and so there's a good energy environment crew there. And so it's not a single person; it's basically all those folks. I think Jesse Jenkins is now doing a podcast. Is it Robinson? In any case,
Yeah.
So I feel like there are some smart voices out there that I also subscribe because I'm doing stuff on critical minerals. So Steve Levine, who used to be at the Washington Post, has a subscription email for insider watchers of what's happening in the critical minerals space. So I think it's like whatever your thing is, find a cohort of people who really know a lot about that and try and get a multidimensional perspective so you're not just, drinking from the Kool-Aid.
All right, we'll try to wrap up with here. This is sort of a question about maybe friendly competition among states here, maybe in the United States, and if there's such thing as a neutral technology. So there's questions about what about geothermal? If this is just uses the same kind of personnel and techniques as oil and gas industry, can this be seen as something that's neutral? Perhaps hydrogen, since it's come from hydrocarbon molecules, this kind of thing. And then one of the references here is can you leverage economic competition between states? Some states are more behind things. There's a reference here to Louisiana versus Texas. So any thoughts on state competition, or is it possible to have technology seem neutral, even from the right or left, right? If there's sort of left and center people, are they coming around to nuclear more, for example?
In my world, there's arguments I see arguments among some of my colleagues over the technologies you listed at the beginning of that question, but I think you're right that the questioner is right that there's broader, let's say, bipartisan or semi-bipartisan support for things like hydrogen production and CCS, and I would say probably geothermal too. Most of the geothermal companies, to the extent any are big, are in Houston now because they're doing what the questioner suggests, that is raiding oil and gas companies for expertise, subsurface expertise. So, I mean, I think technology agnosticism makes a lot of sense, but I wish there was more of it in the public debate.
I think we've seen before lots of instances where something, even this doesn't have to be technology, but policy, right? Cap and trade was initially kind of the Republican embraced ideal, and then it became cap and tax when they were against, right? So I think things can be demonized. It's not the characteristics of the technology, in my view, that are driving that, right? It's simply, right, kind of calculus about what we're trying to achieve, and then let's go after that thing. So I don't think there's anything that's really bulletproof in that way.
So I wanted to comment on this competition between states, but I was thinking interstate competition on the international level. And China is now offering low cost, electric vehicles that are like $12,000. And they, Elon Musk said if they're allowed to enter the US, it will destroy the entire automobile industry. And so I hope that we can figure out a way to make geostrategic competition between the US and China to work for climate protection rather than against it. And that can the US rise above whatever either internal petty instincts or international petty instincts and make stuff better, right? Just make stuff better. And we may not be able to compete on price, but can we innovate the hell out of this sector and come up with all the things that will drive the energy transition better? I have confidence that we can with sustained policy support that we've already seen through the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I just feel like, we've got to unleash the creative, innovative potential of Americans to do that stuff. And some of this partisan stuff will go away because And it may not happen quite as fast as I'd like it to, but if we can cut a whole course, I think in 10 or 15 years, the internal combustion engine will be gone and Republicans and Democrats will both be driving AVs because they're just damn good vehicles. If you see a Rivian around here, I would like one, you know, those are great looking cars. So we could all be driving those pretty soon and they'll be a hell of a lot cheaper if we just allow ourselves to get off of our own backs.
Right, I've often thought maybe, yeah, there could be a climate Olympics, you know, just a fun competition. Solar decathlon across the world country. So, all right, well, thank you very much. I'm gonna leave it for that. Sheila Olmstead, Dr. Buck, thank you.